Okay, looks like we've got a fair few people online now, so we will kick off. Hi everybody, I'm Emma Whittenstall and I am one of the cluster engagement managers for Dynamo, and really pleased to be introducing today's event. For those of you who don't know much about Dynamo, we are a not-for-profit network of businesses and entrepreneurs with the core mission to grow the North East tech economy through collaboration, innovation and skills. So we're the voice of the sector regionally and nationally to generate noise, to promote the region as a hotspot for tech and digital businesses. So our membership, I'm sure some of you are part of that, are made up of tech organizations, large corporate employers, consultants, technology hubs, education providers, local government and suppliers into the industry. So there's a lot of diversity there. And how we support our members is through work in our clusters. So we have clusters in fintech, cybersecurity, service delivery centres, and I'm pleased to say that I head up the health and social care tech cluster. And our speakers today, Difrent, are actually members of that cluster, so I'm really pleased to be welcoming them here today. You can read more about our clusters on the website. We also do a lot of this, hosting events and webinars, so please have a look at the website, see what's coming up, and you can also watch back some previous events as well. There's lots of good stuff on there. As I've said, just feel free to say hi in the chat. We've got the Q&A function on as well. So if you've got specific questions for the speakers, then please put them in there and we'll address those at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dani Allen and Emma Sutcliffe, who will be giving you an introduction into creating accessible services with an accessible research approach.
Thank you. Thanks for coming along, everyone. Myself and Emma today are going to be talking about creating accessible services using accessible content and accessible user research approaches. Next slide, please. So I am Dani Allen. I'm a content designer at Difrent, and as part of my role as content designer, I take complex words and ideas and simplify them so that they're easy to understand. And that can include lots of things on a page, the words, the images, any videos, space in between all of the content on the page. So I do kind of a little bit of everything as part of my role. Before joining Difrent, I spent 2.5 years at HMRC designing content for services, and I spent 10 months of that with a heavy focus on all things accessibility. So it's something that really interested me.
Well, hi everyone, I'm Emma Sutcliffe. I'm a user researcher at Difrent. So part of my role is all around understanding all the people that use a service, and then that informs how it's then designed. Before joining Difrent, I studied an industrial design degree, and I always had a massive interest in user-centered design and social design and design for good. So I did a placement at a digital agency, and that was where I got my real buzz for UX design and user research, and decided to specialise in that area, and that's what I've been doing since, just because I love having that upfront understanding of who are the users, what are the problems, and how can we get a team together to resolve them.
So today we're just going to be talking about what kind of access needs users could have, also how we can improve design and content to make sure services are more accessible and that more people can use them more easily. And then Emma's going to talk a bit about ways to ensure that your research approach is accessible to autistic people specifically. Next slide, please. So when we talk about access needs, this is kind of one of the things that falls under the umbrella of accessibility, which is essentially just making sure you design your products and services so that they can be used by anyone regardless of their access needs. And it covers a range of different conditions and circumstances, and I'm just going to talk through some of those. Next slide, please. So this infographic quite nicely illustrates the sort of more financial side of not having accessible products and services. So how much money businesses are throwing away basically by not making their products and websites and things like that fully accessible to everyone. And that includes things like their support models, so customer services and how people can contact them if they have issues. And it's putting a lot of people off because they can't access the things that they want to or need to, and then they're leaving, which is obviously costing hundreds of billions of pounds a year. But that isn't the only thing that we should be thinking about. So we need to be making services accessible for legal requirements, first of all, so all public sector websites and services have to have an accessibility statement. This was something that became law back in September last year. There has to be an accessibility statement on those public facing services detailing any accessibility issues and when they will be fixed. So there has to be timeframes involved so that things can be as accessible as possible for everyone. But it's also an ethical consideration. It's really unethical, especially in the age we live in and with, you know, the technology that we have available to us, for people with access needs and who use assistive technology to be excluded from using websites, entering buildings even. It's discrimination basically, and it affects people's daily lives. There are services that people need to interact with, so HMRC services, online banking, things like that. And if they can't do that, then it's causing massive amounts of stress for people, which is obviously not great. Next slide, please. So under this sort of umbrella of accessible content and design, today I'm going to be talking about some of the access needs that users can have and some of the ways that we can help mitigate some of those issues, so make our services as accessible as possible to people with access needs. Next slide, please. So there are lots of different types of access needs, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just the sort of the main ones that we think about. These two on this page tend to be the ones that get the most attention because they do involve more assistive technologies. So there's a lot of development work that can go into making services and products accessible to people who use things like screen readers. So for people with visual impairments, so blind people who use screen readers, people with low vision or tunnel vision, other kinds of conditions that affect their eyesight who use zoom in text applications or screen magnifiers. People with colour blindness is another big one. Having adequate colour contrast on screens is really important. So this tool at the side here is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines Contrast Checker. So this is a Chrome plugin that you can get, and it will show you where on a web page the colour contrast isn't adequate for certain types of colour blindness conditions, which is obviously really great and really helpful as a tool. So yeah, ensuring adequate colour contrast, really important. Not embedding text in images is a big one. So if you are using assistive tech to access the content on a page and text is within an image, a screen reader can't pick that up. So that content's completely shut off to someone who relies on a screen reader to interact with the content. Use things like semantic markup. So by this I mean headings on a page. So there's a specific type of heading structure that we use in content design, and that is coded in the right way so that people using assistive technology can access the screen in a logical order. Things like paragraph tags, so they'll indicate where there's a text, a paragraph of text that needs to be interacted with on a page. Things like adding descriptive alt text. So by alt text we mean it's alternative text, so it's used within the HTML code to describe the appearance and function of an image on a page. So not every image on a page needs alt text. It depends on the image and what kind of function that it's got. If it's something that's helpful or that complements the content, then it needs to have alt text so that it explains what the image is and why it's there. And then another one is just providing a skip to main content link at the top of the page. So when someone interacts with a page using a screen reader, having that link means that they can skip past any navigation bars and things like that and get to the main purpose of the page, which is usually the first heading on the page. For users who are deaf or hard of hearing, so this can include people who were born deaf and primarily communicate using sign language, any kind of injury or illness that's resulted in some kind of deafness, environmental things. So if you're in a loud or busy area and you just can't have the sound on for something, temporary ear injuries, things like that. And there are things we can do to help people with hearing issues. So things like providing text equivalents for time-based media, videos, things like that. So subtitles and captions. Provide alternatives, so written transcripts, and giving people enough time to read that alternative content as well. So not adding any kind of time restrictions on how long someone has to interact with that content. Next slide, please. So some of the sort of I guess less focused on access needs are things like mobility issues. So this can be people who can use a mouse but with limited dexterity, more severe mobility issues, so people who rely on keyboard navigation fully, or who use voice recognition or eye movement tracking technology, and then also temporary injuries if you've broken a wrist or sprained something and you just can't interact with something in the way that you usually would. So this is an important thing for us to consider when we're looking at how people navigate a page, for example, with keyboard access. So we need to make sure that all of the elements on the page are accessible to everyone using just a keyboard. So you can tab through the whole screen and you can interact with every piece of content. Having a logical tabbing order, so you're not sort of flinging about all over the place on the screen and it's not confusing people. So we go, for example, for a form, you would go down each of the form elements in turn. Focus states for things like links, paragraphs, headings, so making sure that people can keep track of where they are on a page, so highlight something with a yellow box, for example, obviously with adequate color contrast. So yeah, making sure that we're showing people where the focus of the page is, so we know where they know where they've tabbed to. Maximizing clickable areas for things like links and radio buttons, so when people are using voice activated technology, they have a sort of grid that comes up on the screen and they have to say the grid number of where they want to zoom in, and if clickable areas aren't big enough, they can sometimes it's impossible to get to a certain radio button if it's between two grids, so they can't select that element, so then obviously it's not accessible to them. People with cognitive difficulties, so Emma's going to talk a little bit about this with her user research techniques. So people with learning difficulties and disabilities, autism, dyslexia is a big one, but also things like if you're really stressed or really tired, it's harder to interact with content and it's harder to then take that in and process that information. If someone's got English as a second language, for example, might not understand certain types of language that we're using. So considering all of those elements when we're creating content is really important. So some of the things we can do are kind of the things that underpin content design, basically. So formatting content so that it's easy to scan. So what that means is when someone reads a web page, we read in an F-shaped pattern. So we scan the headings, we look for keywords and key pieces of information. So if you're going to a web page, you have a goal that you want to complete and you look for those bits of information that will help you complete that goal. So nobody reads every single word on a page, or it's rare. And if we can format the page in a way where we have headings and then we have paragraphs of text that relate to that heading, then that makes it much easier to pick out where you need to be on a page, and then you can skip the bits that aren't relevant to the information that you're looking for. Front loading those sentences and those paragraphs is also really important, so making sure that the information that's the most important comes earlier on in the sentence, so they don't have to read the whole sentence to get the meaning of it. Using active voice rather than passive, so I've just put an example here on the screen. A passive example is the mat was sat on by the cat, so something was done to the mat. And then a more active way of saying this would be the cat sat on the mat. Excuse me. So this second example here, we know who the person is, so that's the cat. We know what they're doing, so they're sitting, and then we know what they're doing it to, so they're sitting on the mat. So it's a really direct way of writing that content that means that the meaning is really clear. So using things like plain English is really really important as well. So plain English is a movement that was created in the 70s, basically to kind of delegalize content, so make things easier to understand, use really simple language that people use in everyday life instead of, you know, putting legal jargon or any other kind of jargon, acronyms, things like that. So just basically writing your content in a really simple, easy to understand way, and in a way that people understand it. Having one idea per paragraph, so this is kind of off the back of the Government Digital Service one thing per page concept. So if you have a paragraph, make sure that it's one idea in that paragraph. rather than having kind of multiple concepts, because it's a lot easier to explain one thing at a time than it is to try and explain lots of different things in the same space, basically. So then there are other things to consider. So things like someone's age, any physical or mental health conditions they have, things like epilepsy, anxiety is a big one, which is why I've put it as an example here. Temporary disabilities, so someone who's broken an arm or has a brain injury and just can't interact with things in the way they used to interacting with them. Technical constraints is a big one, so slow internet connection, using old browsers or old technology, people who are completely digitally excluded and rely on phone calls and things like that. There's always got to be a route for those people to be able to access services. And then things like situational constraints, so if you're in a loud place like a busy cafe, if you're holding a child while you're trying to do something on your phone, if you're in a library on a public machine and you obviously don't want certain types of information up on the screen, are all things that we need to consider. And then for users with anxiety, anxiety is something that kind of goes across the board for people with access needs. Not everyone who has an access need suffers from anxiety, but it's fairly prevalent. So this is an important one that we need to consider around sort of allowing people to complete an action in giving people enough time to do that. So not putting timers on things that can cause more anxiety. Explain what happens next. So if you're on a page and you have no idea where a button is going to go, you're less likely to want to press it in case it does something really bad or you lose important information. So try and make that clear to people, what's going to happen next when I do this. Make all of the important information really clear. So ideally just put the important information on the screen, but if there is less important content that needs to be there, make sure the important stuff is right at the top and really clear so that people are getting the information they need. Give people support to complete the task. So this can be having a phone line or an email address that someone can contact if they just can't, that they're not confident enough to complete the task, and having some kind of framework in place to help people do that. And then also things like error messages. So if I do something wrong on a page, tell me what it is, tell me how to fix it. What did I do wrong? What do you need from me? Like, just makes things really, really simple and clear. And then also allow users to check their information before they submit it. So have a screen, a stopping point before that submission, where you can say, this is everything you told us. If you want to change any of it, you can change it. Check it, make sure it's all fine. Especially important for things like government services, or if you're inputting bank details into a service and you want to know that there's that stopping point where you're saying, these are the bank details, this is how much you're going to pay. Now click this button to do that. Just gives people a little bit of time to process the thing that they've just done and can sort of stop some of the anxiety that can be created. Next slide, please. So to make content accessible, again, these are things that we just do as content designers a lot of the time, but there are also things that kind of translate into more technical aspects, and making sure that pages are coded in the right way. So the big one, use plain English, like underpins everything we do in content design. It's the main thing. Make sure you are speaking the language that people speak, that it's really simple, that you're using the kind of words that people expect you to use. So this example here from the NHS, it's almost a sort of glossary of terms. So they have sort of advice for people around medical terms and how to make them more clear for people. Obviously, any kind of appointment or anything like that is already stressful for someone. So then using technical medical terms can be more confusing. So some of these examples include using the word abdomen if someone's familiar with it, but also switch to tummy, make it clear that when you say abdomen, you mean tummy, because that's a more universal term for people. So things like that, just to try and make things as clear as possible. Like, what are you trying to say? What do you need from someone? Using headings and structures, heading structures to make pages scannable. So this is something that needs to be done within the content and design work, but also within the code. So when a screen reader interacts with a page, they have those heading tags in the code that means this is the main heading, so the heading 1, and then you go down the numbers, and then that's a logical order for a screen reader to interact with the page in. Don't use words and phrases that people won't recognise. So more complex language that's just not necessary for the kind of information that you're trying to get across. If it is something that's, for example, a legal obligation to explain something in a certain way, put in an alternative explanation. So explain what you mean by this legal term or whatever it is that you use, and just make sure that you've made it really clear to people. This is what we're trying to tell you, or this is what we're asking for. Next slide, please. So explaining abbreviations and acronyms is quite important, especially in working in government services, which is pretty much what I've done for the last 3 years. There are a lot of acronyms and a lot of abbreviations and a lot of things like that that can sometimes make it into the content. Explain them. If you know that it's fine to explain an abbreviation or an acronym in full and then put in what that is in brackets next to it so that you can use it further down the page, because you've explained what it means right at the top. Unless they're well known or in common use. So for example, you know, if you're interacting with tax services at HMRC, you'll know what VAT is. So in those kind of instances, it's fine to use really basic ones that are really common. Making error messages really clear and also linking them to what they relate to. So these 2 examples here, this top one is a sort of what not to do, essentially. So we have the red is fine. So red is obviously an indication that something's gone wrong. It can scare people a little bit if there's multiple inputs on a page and they're all red. And also that error message at the top there, so highlighted fields have errors. It doesn't really tell me what I've done wrong or where. Like, it just tells me that all of those red things there are things that I've messed up, but I don't know how to fix it. So the bottom example is a much more clear way of doing that. So it's right above the field. It tells you what we need. So you haven't entered anything, enter your full name. It's really simple, it's really clear. And then also within the code, you would link that to the field as well. So again, for people using assistive technology, having an error at the top of the page tells them that there's an error. But unless you then link that to the field that it relates to, they're not going to be able to see that. They're not going to be able to know, navigating the page, where it is that they've done this thing wrong. So make that really clear and also link it in the code to make sure that it's being read out for users who use screen readers. Making links understandable out of context. So I've got an example of this, but it's basically just, so like having a link like read more or click here, it's not really very helpful. When we scan a page, we look at the headings and then we scan the sort of paragraph content down the left-hand side. And then we scan for things like links. So they stand out, they're blue, they're underlined. It makes sense to you know, that they draw your eye. If they all say read more, I don't know what that means. I don't know where that's going. I don't know what's going to happen when I click on it. It's not helpful. So make sure that the link is a sentence and that it's explaining where the link will go when a user clicks on it. And then just keeping sentences short is another really easy one. So anything that's sort of longer than about 20 words is usually too long. There are tools that you can use to do this. I've got some examples a little bit later on. So basically, if you have too many words in a sentence, then it needs to be 2 sentences. Split the content up, make it sort of easier to read and easier to understand. Next slide, please. So descriptive links. So we've got a couple of examples here. So in this scenario, I have come to a web page. I want to register interest in a job role or apply for a job. And I want to know how I can fill in an application form. So if I'm scanning the page and that link just says here, I don't know what that is. Is that where I need to go? Does it relate to something else? It depends entirely on what else is on the page as well. If there's multiple things on a page, that is telling me nothing about where I am. And then in this second example, I've just rewritten it so that we're making it clear that if you click on this link, it will take you to a page that means you can fill in an application form using an online service. So just make the link the sentence, basically. It's really clear. If I've come to a page and that is my goal, then I know if I click on that link, then I'm going to go to this place, which is what I want to do. So yeah, and this is just one way of doing this. There are several ways that you can rewrite this sentence to include that link text in a more clear way. Content design is very subjective a lot of the time. We know there needs to be more detail, but how you present that detail is entirely up to you as a content designer, essentially. Next slide, please. So this is a tool that I use quite a lot in my role. It's called Hemingway, and it's a web app, and it's really good for things like pulling out when you've done too much in a sentence, when there's too many words, when it's hard to read. So this example I just pulled from a random sort of law website about tax. So obviously it's quite a complex subject matter anyway. And then when you're making sentences long like this, it's really, really hard to understand. The language is quite complex, and Hemingway is really useful for telling you when you've done that. So yellow is a sentence that's hard to read, and then the red one is very hard to read. There's just too much going on there. Next slide, please. So then in this example, I've just rewritten that again. You can rewrite things in the window, and you can see the grade going down, which I find quite satisfying. And it's nice to see the sort of where you have done things that could be written better, those disappearing on the side as well. So this again is just one way that you could rewrite that information. I've added some bullet points, which is really good for breaking information up into more sort of digestible chunks. And it also makes it a little bit clearer than a paragraph. If you've got more than one thing or you need to do a list, then this is a really simple, easy way of presenting that content. But it can be done in kind of multiple different ways. Next slide, please. So in order to do all of these amazing things that we're doing with the content and the design, we also need some research with real users with access needs, because we can do a best guess and we can use all of these great principles for content design and accessibility, but unless we've put it in front of real users who use technologies and who have these difficulties every day, we don't know that we're doing it exactly right. And Emma's just going to talk a little bit about her accessible user research approach.
Cool. So today I'm going to be focusing on autism. Autism on a personal level is really, really important to me. I have a family member who's autistic, and we're exactly the same age, but sort of throughout our whole lives, we've had totally unequal opportunities through no fault of his own. And so I sort of set myself on a mission that I was going to really understand this further, understand what the barriers they face and what I can do with my skills to be able to help that. Now, there's 700,000 people with autism in the UK, and that's huge. And you automatically think, if you're putting all these barriers in place, this is how many people you're potentially excluding. So from my final year at university, where I was very much putting everything into understanding autism, I've had the chance to run quite a lot of research with autistic people. And during that time, I've picked up quite a few learnings. I've trialed and errored things. There's been things I've tried and then thought, actually, I'm going to do it a bit different next time. So that's what I'm going to be talking through today. So looking at autism a little bit more, autism is on a spectrum. So it's very rare that you'd meet two autistic people exactly the same. But on screen here, you can see some of the common traits that you'll tend to pick up. So in terms of communication, verbal and non-verbal language, I guess, starting with picking up gestures of other people, picking up on tone of voice is quite challenging, and also if you ask an autistic person an open question, so these are questions starting with how, what, where, who, why, that can be really difficult to answer. They prefer questions where they can answer yes or no. So in terms of like picking up others' emotions, they also struggle to express their own emotions. Very routine focused, so I have a set way of doing things and how they run their lives and their day, and like to stick with that, and any sort of change or last minute change in particular can cause a lot of anxiety. And then in terms of their senses, they have this like hypersensitivity, so particularly to light, sound, colour, temperatures, for example, and any sort of over experience to this can trigger something called a sensory overload, which is this sort of overwhelming feeling of anxiety. And autistic people as well generally have quite highly focused interest around particular subjects. So when I started understanding autism further and then thinking, okay, like my role as a researcher, I then started to see actually there's quite a lot of barriers in our research approaches. And obviously following all best practice and the government service standard, we pride ourselves on creating accessible services. But really, we can't really create an accessible service without an accessible research approach. And if we look here, these are just some things when I've looked at those characteristics, looked at research and our approach and thought, okay, well, we always ask people lots of open questions, like I mentioned before. So how does that make you feel, for example? We encourage like a free form answer. We generally expect people to respond verbally to us. We say, you know, what does that make you feel like? And get people to share their emotion towards things. Our sessions can be long, like they can be long. Sometimes we're covering really complex topics. Often it won't just be the researcher and the participant on a call. There might be the content designer, for example, other designers in the team. So yeah, you sometimes have got a group environment, and sometimes in the good old days when we were in the office, we'd be in a really loud office sometimes with doors banging, which could trigger that sensory overload that I mentioned, or even remotely, like we all know there's always that one person that forgets to go on mute. And if any sort of background noise could also be really inaccessible and trigger that sensory overload. So that just shows actually our research approach as it stands isn't accessible. And this statement becomes really, really important. So to develop an accessible service, we need to use an accessible research approach. So what I'm going to talk to now is just some learnings that I've picked up around running accessible research, thinking about like before the session and during. Now, obviously, these are in the context of user research, but actually there's loads of learnings that could be applied to anyone and anyone's role. So if you want to encourage, you know, inclusive workforce, for example, you need to have a really, really accessible recruitment process. And if you're going to be interviewing someone, these learnings can apply there. But really for any business, it's interacting or communicating with autistic people. These are some really great learnings that you can apply in your own way. So let's make a start then. So the top sort of tips. So thinking about before the session, these are the first three things I always think about. And as I say, these have come through sort of actual experience of doing this, and I've definitely made mistakes and learned from that. And these are the things that I sort of suggest. But it's definitely something that's an ongoing learning as well, all the time. So to start with, building your awareness. Now, you can say, well, actually, Emma, that's going to be really difficult because you've just said that every autistic person is different. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. So really, you need to have that upfront understanding of who's your participants and let's get to know them. And a really good way of doing this is having an upfront session before you've sort of kicked off any of the research activities, just to get to know each other, understand how they best communicate, what is their routine and how you can fit into that. And also just let them know a little bit about you and what your role is as well, because it makes it less daunting. And this is when you can start to really build your understanding of, okay, like how am I going to run this session? What techniques am I going to use and why? How am I going to communicate? Who else am I going to have involved or not? And sometimes it can be hard to get access to the end participant before your session. So another way of doing this is sort of speaking to their parents or carers, or alternatively, charities and organisations have a wealth of knowledge in this area. So there's ways of going around it. The second one is setting expectations. Now, as I said before, autistic people do tend to have quite a regime, and like that they like to stick to that. And your research session is probably going to completely push that routine off. So letting them know as far as possible in advance of what you're expecting and when and how long for can really help them to cope with that change. So giving them this choice of timings is also really good, like we do anyway, but just it's really important in this setting to let them sort of plan their own routine and know what to expect. And also a research session is probably not the norm for many people. Most participants I conduct research with have never done it before. So just setting out really what's going to happen just reduces any anxiety. And a good way to do this for autistic people is sort of setting it out step by step, what to expect, using all those really great content design principles that Dani's just spoken to make sure it's really clear and they understand what's going to happen. Sometimes accompanying those with really descriptive images, so the right images, or a series of short videos can also be really helpful if you've got the time. And all this sort of builds to the third point, is around like building trust and confidence. They trust you, they know who you are, they're confident in the session, and they're happy to take part. And obviously that is really important for any research we do. We want people to be happy to take part. Now, then I know you're all going to be thinking, well, this is going to add so much time and cost onto a project. You know, usually we do like 7 to 10 research sessions. Are you going to say we need to double them? Now, what I am saying is I can't stress the importance of doing this upfront work. It makes everything else really, really interesting and useful. And if you've not sort of understood your participant at the start, like, you're not going to get that really rich research insight when you need it. And the first time I actually did do research with autistic people, I went straight in and did the telephone interview straight away. And I literally from the get-go, I was like, this isn't working. Like, I wasn't getting the responses back. I could tell the participant was a little bit anxious. So I did end up sort of finishing that session earlier, and that doesn't start on the right footing. You want to have that confidence and trust, I guess, from the start. So yeah, it just shows the importance, and it's something I really do always consider now going forward. So thinking about during the session, again, 3 things I always think about. So the first one is considering your environment. Well, thinking of obviously in the office, if you were doing in-person research, you don't want lots and lots of background noise, lots of people there, or if you've got like those really bright downlights that are often in offices, that doesn't work at all. And when I first did a group session with a group of different people with different learning difficulties, it was very noisy, and the activity involved a lot of people. And as the session went, I started seeing some people just sort of walking out, and they didn't want to engage. So this really shows the importance of having like a quieter, smaller setting, making sure that everyone's comfortable and not getting overloaded with sensors. And I guess thinking about now the world we're in at the moment with the remote working and remote research, making sure that you've not got like background noise, people are going on mute, and just having the lowest number of people possible. And with the participants' consent, you can always record the session anyway, so you can share it afterwards, just to avoid that overload. And then communication is a huge thing. Any researcher will know you've got to communicate in the right way to get the insights you need. So you've got to think about all those things I mentioned before. Avoid, I love a good question, but try not ask too many questions. Restrict it down. What's the lowest number I can ask? What is the most concise way I can say this question to someone? And also, if they are struggling to answer to open questions that I mentioned, offering choices rather than expecting them to come up with an answer is a really good way of doing it. And directing the question and saying their name so they know you're talking to them. And something I've seen work well in person is like actually passing around a physical object. So when it's your time to talk, just so it encourages that turn taking. And the last one is all around the activities that you use. Like, how can you make this a little bit more engaging and creative rather than just a conversation where we're going to be like pummeling someone with a load of questions? And I always try and think like, what's a creative way that I can get the insight I need? And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit to now. So this is an activity that I sort of developed, building on a current method, which is a desktop walkthrough. And what I needed to do was I'd come up with a concept, and I needed to evaluate it with users, because that's the best way you're going to get the insight you need, because they're the people that are going to be using it. So I was like, okay, how am I going to do this? And the context was in a train station, so there was no way I was going to take people there. And sometimes understanding abstract concepts can be quite difficult as well. And also I was like, how am I going to maintain attention? I'm going to be wanting to get lots of feedback. How am I going to do this? So I built it all out of Lego, which was really fun, and built out the main sort of touch points in the journey, so where they'd be interacting with the service. So you'd have your start, their home, the train station, the train, the character that they're going to be using, which is them, and then the end. And the participant will be holding that little Lego character to try and maintain their focus. And to get around getting sort of responses back, and how do I do that, I created these emoji cards. And I had picked up earlier on that emojis were getting used quite a lot in any sort of comms, and I noticed at the college they were using them a lot. So I was like, okay, and like we all know that like emojis are like the design language of the 21st century, really, like everyone is using them. So instead of getting people to respond verbally over time, I get them to pick a card that best described how that made them feel. Some would circle like this, how the intensity of that feeling and write why, and others won't, which was absolutely fine. It was just there if it worked. So a bit of a workflow. So what would happen is the participant would move their Lego character around that board. I would be using storytelling to describe, you know, how that service solution would be interacting with them at each sort of movement. And then they would then pick up one of those cards that best described how that made them feel. And this was a really great way, and it was also really fun and creative, and it made the session so much more interesting as well, rather than just a straightforward conversation. And it really made me sure that I got the insight I needed. And I suppose just to like conclude on all that, these things I've spoken to today, this isn't an approach you should just use if you're engaging with autistic people. If you apply all these principles, it makes the session more accessible and usable for all. Like just thinking back to the start, if you set out clearly step by step what's going to happen in a session, that's going to make anyone feel a lot more comfortable and confident in taking part. So Dani now is just going to talk through some tips and learning she's got around writing content for autistic people.
Thanks, Emma. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Easy Read. So this is a type of content format that was designed in a way that kind of takes into account those cognitive difficulties experienced by autistic people or anyone with any kind of learning difficulty or disability. It can be really helpful for people with dementia, anyone who has any kind of cognitive issue or can't quite process information in the same way. So this is it's a really simple kind of concept. It's quite difficult to put into practice because boiling things down to these really, really basic steps is a hard thing. But it's essentially a combination of a really useful image with a line of really simple information. So this example here from the NHS about the importance of getting your free flu jab quite nicely illustrates the sort of format. There are lots of other sort of parts of the NHS that use this format. I first came across it. So like Emma, I have a family member who's autistic. So my sister is autistic. We live together. I share some of the care and responsibilities for her. And we discovered we were having some issues with some speech and language therapy and trying to explain things in a really simple way because she can't take in more than one step at a time. She needs it to be really, really basically set out and then have time to kind of process the information before you move on to the next thing. And they sent us a whole bunch of really great easy read stuff for her to have a look at. And it meant she could sit and read it in her own time as well, which was great, and interact with it how she felt comfortable. And it worked so well that I kind of wanted to look into it a little bit more. So essentially the idea is that the image would be something that complements the information that you're trying to get across. So they've used photos in this example. You can design your own images as long as it's adding something. So as long as that content, that image is adding something and giving people that little bit of extra information and then that extra step that they need. And then the line of content is just really, really basic boiled down information. So it's a kind of almost a step up from using plain English. So again, it's just a little bit more simplified. We have to really think about the kind of words that we're using and the structure of the sentence as well. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to get your head around. I was involved in some workshopping in a previous role for Easy Read, and we had this whole brilliant workshopping process where we got people to think about how to apply for a job and then try and put that into an easy read format. So we were drawing pictures on whiteboards, and it was back when we were in the office, so like it was really interactive, and really thinking about the kind of content that you want to put alongside that. What do we need to say? What is the step, each step of the process? So yeah, it was a really, really interesting thing to get involved in. And it's definitely something I think everyone should have a little go at as well, because I think it can be so useful in so many different kind of scenarios for people. And obviously just make sure all of your content has that extra step of being really accessible for people with cognitive difficulties.
Bro, so just to summarise everything we've spoken about today, we do just see it as an equation, really. And if you do have that accessible research approach, and then you have the accessible content and design, automatically you're going to create a service that is accessible and more usable for all. So I hope you all really enjoyed that, and we're happy to answer any questions that have come through the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma and Dani, that was brilliant. Yeah, I'm just picking one up here. From Josie. It can be challenging to get all of the knowledge, tools and methods into standard practice within a content design and wider UX team. How would you recommend a team go about adopting all of this?
So this is kind of something that I've seen issues with in my role in other places. It's something that's quite hard to adopt, especially if the team that you're on has no real sort of knowledge base. The big thing for me is knowledge sharing. So bringing people in who do have more knowledge. In a previous team that I worked in, we had a great front end developer who had a lot of knowledge around the content side of things as well as the coding side of things, and that it really makes it real for people. And it gives you real world examples as well, because I think it's really easy for me to sit here and say these are some great content examples for accessibility and creating accessible content and design, but it's hard to relate that to the thing that you're looking at. And we all work across multiple different areas and on different kinds of services, and it can be really hard to apply that. One of the things that worked really, really well on my last team was having just a weekly accessibility catch-up. So we had a meeting that we got as many people as possible involved in, and everybody brought a little bit about accessibility that they'd learned or that they'd never seen before. I'd been quite heavily involved in the accessibility side of things, so I did a couple of presentations about all of the things that I'd been working on and how it improves things for people. So I think it's a difficult one to get going, but if you can try and get in those kind of regular catch-ups and get some knowledge sharing going, then that can really help.
I think from my perspective, what I typically do, so I had a session the other week with a deaf participant, and straight away I was sort of sharing those learnings with the team. And I think it is trying to get people involved as much as you can, even if it's observing a research session. If you know you're going to have one with someone with an accessibility need, bring them in, because I don't think you really understand it until you meet someone with one. Do you know what I mean? It's really hard to understand and get into their head. So yeah, seeing it and meeting someone is probably the best thing I can say. Okay,
then, and on the flip side of that, I guess if you're a freelancer, you're just working on your own, you have a website, you don't have an UX team to kind of help you with this kind of stuff. Where would you go there? What would be the place that you'd start with?
So there's some really helpful sort of information sites and things like that out there. I posted one of them in the Q&A earlier on, just with a really basic checklist of things to start with. A big one for me would be the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I'll post a link there in the chat. So that is basically that's the guidelines that we have to follow by law for any kind of public sector website or service. So that has all of the information in around what isn't accessible and what you can do to improve that. So it's really, really useful. It's huge. There's a lot of information in there, and it does take a while to go through. And there's still loads of stuff in there that I haven't had a chance to look at. But it's really, really useful if you're looking for certainly for things specifically relating to the thing that you're working on. So you can have a look through all of the different sort of regulations that they have, and then it details where it fails the guidelines, how it fails the guidelines, and then what you can do with the code and kind of within the content as well to improve it and to make it more accessible. So that's a really, really useful resource. I'll post the link in the chat there.
And sometimes you can set up a screen reader, for example, on your laptop, and you can see what it would be like. And obviously it's not as doesn't, if you get someone with a screen reader to use it, that's so much better. But just doing that just opens your eyes yourself. So if you were really struggling, that could be a starting point.
Fab, that's great, thanks. And then just thinking about who does this really well, who are like the really great examples that you can give if people want to go away and have a look at a website where, you know, they're doing all of these things brilliantly. Obviously you probably want to talk about the work that you're doing, but anyone that kind of stands out for you?
So there's been a fair amount of work on some of the HMRC services certainly that I've worked on recently. I spent some time working across all of the live services. So I would say have a sort of nose around in certain places. So there's the NHS website, they have all of their sort of accessibility statements live, so they're in the footer of the website, so you can have a look in the statement, you can see where they've detailed what's not working, why it's not working, so there's loads of detail in those that's really useful, and that you can link back to the web content accessibility guidelines as well, so then you can have a look for yourself and see kind of what the thing is to fix that. But yeah, just I think like most of sort of how I started out before I got obviously involved in the team work with all of the accessibility stuff was just being really nosy. I just like to have a look on these. Certainly the public sector, so NHS and HMRC knows about, see how things look, have a look at their accessibility statements. Yeah, there's loads of great sort of examples out there of where services aren't accessible but they've been audited. So accessibility statements have kind of 3 states, I guess. So there's a kind of not audited state, there's an audited and it passed everything state, and then there's we have some accessibility things that need to be fixed. And they're really, really useful to look at. So you can have a look at how, what's been checked first of all. So there's automated checks that go on, and then there's other stuff that is more content related. So things like error messages that don't make sense out of context and things like that. So yeah, they're a really good place to start if you're looking for just what are kind of there's common themes across all of these services, and everything's being updated sort of as they go. There's deadlines on all of them and things like that.
Yeah, and there's the Gov posters that set out different accessibility needs and the do's and don'ts, and that is such a clear way, just as a quick reference point as well, just to like scan down and look at the service you're working on, but you might like be like, oh, actually we're doing it in the wrong way and this is how I can do that. So yeah, they're like a really good starting point. We can post a link to them as well. More than happy to do that.
Right, I just did the classic being on mute then. We've got another question in terms of assuring accessibility, would you advocate for a company like DAC to conduct an audit, or are there other ways to check?
So DAC is something that certainly is used by a lot of public sector bodies, because they obviously have experts in accessibility and how to check for different things. I think they are a really useful resource. So we kind of had a sort of joint shared kind of way of doing things on past projects that I've worked on, where we would conduct internal audits depending on if we had the experts available. So in some of the organisations there is a specific accessibility team, and some of the people on that team ideally have access needs or use screen readers or use some kind of assistive technology. So then you'd go to them and potentially do a sort of DAC audit as well. But I do think it's definitely worth getting some kind of expert eyes on it, because there are only certain things that we can do. Like certainly in my role as a content designer, I took a massive interest in this, so I got quite heavily involved in the more technical side as well. But that's not for everyone, and it's not something that everyone's expected to do. So yeah, there are experts out there like such as DAC, and I think they're definitely a useful resource.
That's great, thank you. And just finally, Emma, do you feel like the actual research part of it is something that kind of gets missed quite a lot when if you're again just going back to the example of like having a small business, and I feel like sometimes you haven't got enough time in the day to do everything, and that's something that probably gets missed sometimes. But how crucial is it for people to be making sure that they're doing that research of their users?
Yeah, like to be honest, like it's always like time and budget, like they're the main things, and obviously a lot of things I've spoken about today do take extra time, but it is just so important. And I feel like, especially with my family member, like we do see the things that have gone wrong. If there had been some user research up front, like I know some recruitment processes that he's been through unsuccessfully, and if they'd have just done some user research with autistic people, they'd have like ironed those out. So yeah, it is just really important, and I think it's for us, like in this industry now, we should be like putting this at the forefront that, you know, we can't create a good service if it's not accessible to everyone, so you need to be encouraging everyone to be involved in the part of creating it.
So true. All right, well, I think we're just about out of time now, so Emma, Dani, thank you so much for that. As I said earlier, you'll be able to watch this recording once that's back up online, and we'll post it out to the participants and you can share it around. Thanks again, guys, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming along, everyone.